The Language of Orthodox Theology and Quantum Mechanics, St. Gregory, Palamas, and Niels, Bohr. This will be a reading and analysis from the book Energy in Orthodox Theology and Physics, From Controversy to Encounter. I did a live stream earlier where I read from some of this chapter, but I found it compelling, so I wanted to do this separate video to read the entire chapter. It's not that many pages, actually probably about 20 pages, and do a bit of an analysis if I have time, or maybe start and stop in terms of analysis as we go. I think this speaks to the, this book was written in 2017, and some of the information that's being explored here, I think, can speak to the postmodern linguistic conundrum that we find ourselves in since really 2017. How the linguistic landscape has been kind of overturned and manipulated, and how can we explore through the convergence of the language of Orthodox theology and quantum mechanics, putting St. Gregory Palamas in dialogue with Niels Bohr. How can this maybe inform our analysis of what's been going on? That's kind of what came to me and what made me want to and do this video here. And I'm out, it's a beautiful day here in Florida. I'm out at this local park here. So I figured what better time to read together than right now. Again, I hope everybody's having a wonderful Christmas break. Here it is in 2022 when I'm recording this. So I'd love to know what you guys think. If you want to hear more explorations in this manner, I find it fascinating. Therefore, I'm gonna kind of dive right in here. All right, introduction. The terminological or linguistic aspects of Orthodox theology are highly relevant within the context of post-modernity, which is posing challenges to both the mission of the Orthodox Church today and her attitude towards scientific progress in general. So these are the challenges being posed here by postmodernism to the Orthodox Church today and the Orthodox Church's attitude towards scientific progress in general. Christos Yanaris points out that one of the key characteristics of postmodernity is the emergence of a new language in dealing with ontology and reality, a language emerging from two different scientific disciplines, quantum mechanics and post-Freudian psychology. I would have to agree, and I'm interested in this convergence here. Christos Yanaris sees the postmodern duty of the Church in the creative appropriation and not simply adoption of this new language aimed at linking the salvific message of the gospel to linguistic categories that could be more efficient in the interpretation of, quote, the reality of existence, the appearance and disclosure of being, close quote, and more specifically in the articulation of the experiential mode of the relationship between God, world, and man. According to Yanaris, such appropriation could become the source of a new proposal coming from the Church to deal with postmodernity and not just to modernize herself. So I like this idea of the tradition being a living tradition, a living force. It's not just a nostalgia for a conservative past. It is a living force that is more than willing and able and eager to encounter any modern or postmodern emergences or ideas or discourses that emerge. If the tradition, if Christianity is the truth, right, then in any case it should be able to engage with any secular, post-secular, postmodern ideas that come out. And I think this this dialogue between Orthodox theology and quantum mechanics is a fertile place to explore here. Back to the text. I'm not sure if I agree or how much I agree with Yanaris. I would ever agree with him that our present situation might be able to provide a greater advantage as compared to the age of the Church Fathers, who were very much proficient in the sciences of their own time, but still did not have the amazing access to scientific information that is openly accessible today, and that could be found helpful for a better articulation of the distinction between what is real and unreal, between reality and its deceiving reflected image, the quote-unquote idol. So I think it's an interesting point to say that the Church Fathers were more kind of well-versed and inculcated in the process of science, whereas now we have a cornucopia, a plethora of scientific information. So it's a little bit of a different nuanced distinction there. Back to the text. According to others, the challenge of postmodernity is related to the apparent failure of the postmodern epistemological project to secure a secular basis for philosophy by transforming the metaphysical search for the ultimate ground of reality into a quest for its epistemic foundations. So he's saying here is that the failure of postmodernity to have an answer for the overriding metaphysical structures that they deconstructed is apparent now in our time. So because of this divide, this difficulty, it opens up a space to maybe explore further using the Orthodox theological lens. According to Scott Pentecost, it is exactly this failure that constitutes postmodernity. It resulted into a shift of focus from exploring and partaking of reality, on the one hand, to an obsession with the methodological correctitude of the knowledge of the knowing process, thus detaching or emptying language from its inherent link to reality and from its eventful ontological resourcing. So this postmodern discourse has gutted language from its correspondence to reality, and that leaves a vacuum. And I think this is why we're seeing this new language, new pronouns, whatever it may be. It's trying to take root ontologically, not just being a description of a personality type, but a description of an essence, in a sense. And I think this is he's keying in here to the problem, even though he's not using that as a specific example. Unfortunately, a very similar postmodern trend can be found also in everyday church life, where many of the words appear to have lost their authentic meaning and power. This is a danger with significant theological and ecclesial implications, since one can formally adopt the dogmatic articulation of the faith and even turn it into a linguistic idol without really encountering or partaking in the sacramental events. According to Yannaris, this could not be called a real heresy, but is a real tragedy. According to the late Father John Romanides, and I love this sentence here, the detachment of spiritual life from the cognitive content of contemplative experience is exactly the point where belief turns into superstition and orthodoxy turns into religion. The objective of this chapter is to provide an analytical framework that would enable the comparison of the ways of using words and language in the case of St. Gregory Palamas and Niels Bohr. The main motivation will be to explore Christos Yannaris' point about the opportunity of using quantum mechanics as a source of a new language that could be useful in enchanting the power of theological statements. I think that's a fascinating exploration there, right? Because I think part of the source, language is being used and manipulated in this sense because of this divide or this split between ontology and epistemology that was inaugurated really by the postmodern deconstructionists. I think it's interesting exploring this use of new language or exploring the energy of this space in this way. It is important, back to the text, it is important to point out that the main goal here is to use insights from existing studies to provide a preliminary comparative analysis. The novelty in such an approach should be sought in the possibility of using the comparison to identify common linguistic themes, the discussion of which could become a source of insights for both theology and physics. On one hand, such an approach could be methodologically beneficial for the ongoing science-theology dialogue. On the other hand, it could be highly relevant within the context of Christian homiletics and apologetics, and it is precisely this aspect that is of greatest interest here. The discussion will necessarily focus on epistemological issues, touching on the nature of the relation between the meaning of words and the reality they represent. That's the connection or the nature and relation between signifier and signified, I would say. The focus on epistemological issues could be justified by the fact that both St. Gregory Palamas and Niels Bohr have been acknowledged for their epistemological insights. So we're going to turn now to St. Gregory Palamas and the nature of the distinction in the debate that he was having with Barlaam in the 13th century, and really situated on the nature of the difference between the essence and energies, God's essence and energies. So to the text here. Here's the controversy. The controversy between Barlaam, the Calabrian, and St. Gregory Palamas has become the subject of multiple recent studies. The goal of this section is to emphasize one particular perspective, which focuses on some of the linguistic aspects of the debate. The key charge of Barlaam against the hesychasts was their claim about the vision of the divine light. He did not dispute the experience itself, but its interpretation. According to him, the interpretation could be based on one out of two possible options. One, the monks are speaking either about a sensible light or about the ousia of God. And since, according to Barlaam, the divine ousia is unknowable, the essence, there is one single option left. The light that was seen by the monks and by the apostles on Mount Tabor is a sensible, creaturely phenomenon. According to Barlaam, there can be no contemplation of a divine light per se, because the only light that can be contemplated by the intellect is related to the knowledge of creatures and, or, quote, the knowledge expressed in words. And the knowledge possessed by the mind remains always associated with rational discourse. This relationship between divine knowledge, knowledge about creatures, and the words expressing them was a point that became the subject of Palamas's criticism. And I think so Barlaam here, from my perspective, he's putting forth the, kind of the roots of the postmodern ethic, right? Is that words you can't access any kind of transcendent, origin or essence or energy of words by using. They're completely arbitrary, and signifiers are only relate to other signifiers. There's no ontological, kind of anchor here. That's Barlaam's argument, and I think we can use St. Gregory Palamas' refutation of this argument to inform us of how we can engage with this postmodern, situation we find ourselves in. All right, quote, "By my words I stand against other words, and not against the one who speaks." It is important to point out that from the very beginning of the controversy, St. Gregory puts an emphasis on the discursive format of their discussion by asking Barlaam to put his thoughts in writing and by engaging into a written defense of the hesychasts. Hesychast is a Greek word. It means ησυχία. It means peace. These are the monks that and saints that we currently still have today in Mount Athos. In a lot of monasteries, they practice hesychasm, which is a type of contemplative, prayerful, simple life of doing work and constantly praying for others. Back to the text. As the controversy develops, St. Gregory makes it clear that the discussion between them is not a personal issue, and he does not oppose Barlaam himself, but his words. And it is precisely Barlaam's words, his written and defended opinions, that become the source of his concerns. St. Gregory points that in his opposition, he is not arguing for himself, but has taken the burden of speaking on behalf of his less illiterate fellow brother monks. Thus, the discussion moves into the context of the spiritual practice of the Church. Quote, It ought to have sufficed to tell this man who fights about words and presents himself combatively that it is neither our custom nor that of God's Church to be guided by idle words. Another key distinction I think here that Palamas is putting forth, that I don't identify you in my critique with your words, right? And think about now when we have something like, Twitter and bannings and people being, canceled, quote unquote, canceled for something they said a while back, right? There's distinctions being blurred between the words and the person, the subject, the hypostasis on the other end of those words. Okay, he goes, according to St. Gregory, the Calabrian is satisfied with mere words and fails in seeking the truth of things which is acquired through experience and manifested in deeds. Quote, we think that, he says, that true opinion is not the knowledge discovered through words and reasonings, but that which is demonstrated through both deeds and life, and which alone is not only true, but also certain and immutable. Close quote. Barlaam's failure to go beyond words to reality underlies one of the key concerns of Palamas. Quote, every word contests another. Words, once given a status independent of that which they signify, are subject to the will and to the specific context of their users. Again, words, once given a status independent of that which they signify, are subject to the will and to the specific context of their users. Quote, not only are the vices set alongside the virtues, but also impious words seem to be so near to pious ones that by a slight addition or subtraction they easily transform into each other and change entirely the meaning of the words. In this way, for those unable to detect the slightest omission or addition, nearly every false opinion wears the mask of truth. That's just a profound quote from St. Gregory Palamas' Triads. I think how relevant that is for our time right now. I think of the idea that words are kind of magic, right? That's why they call them, to spell, right? And there's linguistic trickery that has an actual effect on the world, and it's very subtle to find the distinction between what's true and what's false. And this was written, again, that quote, 800 years ago. All right, back to the text here. Barlaam, according to St. Gregory, hides himself in complication, conundrums and ambiguities about the different meanings of words, seeking to mislead, quote, by his fair use of words. In contrast, quote, we are not deceived, St. Gregory says, nor we deceive others by the sounds of words, but entering into their inner meaning of words, we are guided by the truth of things. Things are not to be altered because of names, quote, but the meaning of that which is thought should be changed or transposed according to things, for things are the cause of names, and not names of things. Close quote. Next section, going beyond the words to the reality they represent. In the debate over the nature of the light seen by the hesychasts, St. Gregory charges Barlaam with holding that, quote, there is nothing above knowledge, and that it is only, quote, spoken knowledge that is light. With respect to that, St. Gregory claims that there are two philosophies, a philosophy in words and another in deeds, and that there are many and various differences between them. He sees Barlaam's philosophy as being strictly discursive, bounded by language and ultimately incapable of true knowledge of reality. The danger of such a philosophy is found in the restriction of the activities of the mind to discursive reasoning alone, which makes the cognitive aspects of contemplation merely impossible. Whenever Barlaam speaks of contemplation, he reduces it to the level of knowledge of created beings, and the monks, quote, did not think it fit to call him a contemplative. The focus on discursive knowledge alone, quote, evidences a denial that one can go beyond words to the reality they indicate. That is, we can speak about God, but since he is transcendent, cannot encounter God himself. And, quote, it is not the same to say something about God as it is to possess and see God. For apophatic theology is a word, whereas contemplation surpasses words. The intellect, theologizing apophatically, thinks those things that are different from God and thus acts by discursive reasoning. But in the other case, there is union. Contemplation is not simply abstraction and negation, but union and deification. This is a great retort to the dialectic, right? Thesis, antithesis to negation. This double negation is kind of the movement of the absolute from a very simplistic Hegelian perspective, or a very simplistic interpretation. But he's saying contemplation is not simply an abstraction or a negation. He's saying that it is, I lost my place here. For apophatic theology is a word, whereas contemplation surpasses words. Contemplation is not simply abstraction and negation, but union and deification. Close quote. The light seen by the hesychast is a pledge of union with God and a true encounter with him. The light of Barlaam's contemplation is restricted to the realm of concepts, to discursive thoughts and words related to natural phenomena. Quote, the philosopher teaches that the knowledge we have from creatures is the most perfect vision of God. But the knowledge of natural phenomena cannot be the measure of human progress towards the likeness of God. Quote, such knowledge is trapped by a superficial consideration of phenomena paralleling the superficiality of words, since every being that knows is established and remains in that which it knows. Close quote. The next section is the meaning of symbols. A true philosopher should recognize the symbolic transparency of beings, and this recognition acknowledges that the wisdom of God is fulfilled in creatures, and every symbol should be able to open up the one who is being symbolized. Wow, that's a mouthful. I'm going to read it again here. A true philosopher should recognize the symbolic transparency of beings, and this recognition, the symbolic transparency of beings, acknowledges that the wisdom of God is fulfilled in creatures, and every symbol should be able to open up the one who, in capital letters, is being symbolized. The opening of the one who is being symbolized makes it possible for man to see him. Quote, but Barlaam says this light was a sensible light, visible through the medium of the air, appearing to the amazement of all, and then at once disappearing. One calls it, quote-unquote, divinity since it is a symbol of divinity, close quote. We can see how the question about the created nature of the light on Mount Tabor brought in the discussion about the nature and meaning of symbols. Quote, for Barlaam, a symbol could only be something other than the reality it represented. So for Barlaam, a symbol could only be representing for something, right? Something other than reality it represented. Quote, what saint, asked St. Gregory, has ever said that this light was a created symbol? When all the saints agree in calling this light true divinity, how do you dare to consider it alien to the divinity, calling it, quote, a created reality, a, quote, symbol of divinity, and claiming that it is inferior to our intellection, close quote. St. Gregory admits the challenges of using the term symbol. Quote, this is why the choir of inspired theologians have almost all been wary of calling the grace of this light simply a symbol, so that people should not be led astray by the ambiguity of this term to conclude that this most divine light is a created reality, alien to the divinity. Nevertheless, the phrase, quote, symbol of divinity, wisely and properly understood, cannot be considered absolutely opposed to the truth. Quote, for every symbol either derives from the nature of the object of which it is a symbol, or belongs to an entirely different nature. As to signs which are not connatural in this way, and which have their own independent existence, they are sometimes considered symbols. Thus, a burning torch could be taken as a symbol of attacking enemies. If they do not possess their own natural existence, they can serve as a kind of phantom to foretell the future, and then the symbol consists only in that. A natural symbol always accompanies the nature which gives them being, for the symbol is natural to the nature. As for the symbol which derives from another nature, having its own existence, it is quite impossible for it constantly to be associated with the object it symbolizes, for nothing prevents it from existing before and after its object. For that is impossible as soon as it has appeared. It at once is dissolved into non-being and disappears completely. Thus the light of Tabor is a symbol. It is either a natural or a non-natural one. And if someone says that this light is an independent reality, separate from the nature of him whom it signifies, of whom it is only a symbol, then let him show where and what kinds this reality is, which is shown by experience to be unapproachable, and not only to the eyes, and which alone shone forth from the venerated face of the body of Christ. For otherwise, if it were an independent reality, eternally associated with Christ in the age to come, he would be composed of three natures and three essences, the human, the divine, and that of this light. So it is clearly demonstrated that this light is neither an independent reality nor something alien to the divinity. Close quote. The Taboric light was not simply an external phenomenon, but an, quote, an hypostatic symbol, which means that it was real even if it did not have an independent existence or hypostasis of its own. Quote, clearly this term is not used to affirm that it possesses its own hypostasis, close quote. An hypostatic reality occupies a place in between the self-subsistent and the accidental. In the case of the Taboric light, it both symbolizes and is divinity. It is accessible to perception yet transcends it. As an hypostatic symbol enables the beholder to participate in the divine. All right, the last section in this chapter from exploring the work and the ideas of St. Gregory Palamas is entitled The Modes of Knowledge and the Role of the Passions. We just went over the meaning of symbols. I'm going to read this last couple of pages here, and then before I'm going to make part 2 where we get into this analysis of Niels Bohr, and then at the end of the chapter there's a comparison. All right, to the text here. The modes of knowledge and the role of the passions. The real problem of St. Gregory Palamas and the approach of Barlaam and his followers is not the pursuit of knowledge of beings, but in their limitation to remain voluntarily trapped into what is merely an introductory knowledge of God without recognizing that, quote, God established the principles of nature as material for the soul's discursive power, but did this in order that they could lead it to a higher knowledge, close quote. There is no conflict between these higher and lower modes of knowledge, but there must be a right epistemological ordering. Following this epistemological order provides an ascetic with a contemplative approach to thought that is characteristic of all true knowledge, and it is exactly this true knowledge that is most intensively pursued by the hesychast monks. Ignoring the right epistemological order makes the Barlaamites blind to their higher mode of knowledge and makes them think that, quote, they know everything in the abundance of their wisdom, close quote, without recognizing that the possession of universal knowledge belongs to God alone. St. Gregory relates such epistemological arrogance to an ancestral sin of Adam, to the prideful desire to be equal to God, which includes the ignorance of the ascetical dimension of true knowledge. This ascetical dimension is related to a humble approach to knowledge, which is expressed in the fact that the process of knowing should allow both for the object to determine the appropriate mode of knowing, and also for the activity of the knowing subject to cooperate by anticipating and contributing to this determination. It is in this cooperation that the God-given inner intelligibility and the divine principles of all things are manifested. They are not given in advance and have to be allowed to emerge on their own. And the problem does not consist in the human inability to know the divine principles in created beings, but in fact they are being obscured by the human passions. Wow, that's a wonderful passage there. Quote, our passions lower an obscuring veil over the soul's eyes, rendering it incapable of seeing the principles. Thus the lustful man gazing at a woman and the glutton slavering over the food do not truly understand what is that is before them. They see only objects fit to their passions. Thus, when beings in general are understood as, for example, utilitarian objects, they are not understood as they are. While such impassioned comportments towards being can give rise to the appearance of a knowledge of them, it is in fact merely the projection of one's passions into that which can satisfy them. Close quote. Say, quote from St. Gregory, again from 700 years ago. That is, if that's not the essence of the definition of projection that we hear in the 21st century, that we hear psychology and bring it up like it's a new concept here. All right, the section is the purification of the soul versus a focus on method. The way to deal with such confusion is to develop the ability to seek the true knowledge of beings as they are by the purification of the soul from the passions and of the abandonment of evil. In this way, asceticism, humility, and the purification of the soul become a key component in the process of knowing. Barlaam, however, replaces asceticism with method. This is why in his triad, St. Gregory Palamas attacks those who rely on logical demonstrations, which according to him constitute the art that is concerned with words, and do not go beyond the words to reality. The difference between ascetical spiritual exercises and the methods championed by Barlaam is that the former seek to transform the soul by opening it to receive the truth, while the latter seek to produce discursive knowledge, and especially knowledge that is set forth in treatises. Scott Pentecost identifies this difference with the difference that lies between activism and active receptivity, since for Barlaam, acquiring wisdom is a human work, while for Palamas it is a gift that can be received only by a properly prepared soul. Scott Pentecost also points out that these are two completely different attitudes towards true knowledge and towards the sciences in general. The difference uncovers Barlaam's non-ascetic methodological and discursive approach to thought as an early expression of naturalism. But most interestingly, quote, Barlaam represents not merely a revival of decidedly secular studies, but the introduction into Byzantine thought of the principles that make possible the modern scientific attitude. Thus, although the Byzantine Empire would not survive to see the full implications of Barlaam's thought, there is reason to see in this, quote, knowledge without love an affinity to modern science. Close quote. The last section before I sign off this time is we go to an example from the homilies of St. Gregory Palamas. It's worth pointing out that St. Gregory Palamas addresses the question about the use of words and their relationship to wisdom in his homilies as well. In one of his homilies on Palm Sunday, he points out how the reading from Christ's gospel shows that, quote, those exalted in honor, wealth, and power, and those who concern themselves with words and the acquisition of wisdom by means of them, even if they wish to be saved, are in need of greater force and diligence. since they are less obedient by nature. Close quote. Here is a block quote. Okay. The miracle performed on Lazarus openly proved that one who did it to be God. The miracle performed on Lazarus openly proved the one who did it to be God. But whereas the people were convinced and believed, the rulers of that time, that is to say, the scribes and the Pharisees, were so far from being persuaded that they raged against him even more, and resolved in their madness to hand him over to death, although everything he had said and done plainly declared him to be the Lord of life and death. No one can say that the fact that the Lord lifted up his eyes at the time and said, quote, "Father, I thank thee, thou hast heard me," was an obstacle to their regarding him as equal to the Father, since he went on to say, quote, "I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people which stand by I said it, and they may believe that thou hast sent me." Close quote. So that they may know he was God and came from the Father, and also that he did not work miracles in opposition to God, but in accordance with God's purpose. He lifted up his eyes to God in front of everybody and spoke to him in words which make it clear that he who was speaking on earth was equally to the Heavenly Father on high. Notice that the Father and the Son are of equal honor and have the same will. The words are in the form of a prayer for the sake of the crowd standing by, but they are not in the words of prayer, but a lordship and absolute authority, Lazarus, quote, "Lazarus, come forth." And at once the man who had been dead 4 days stood before him alive. Did this come about by the command of the life-giver or his prayer? He cried with a loud voice again on account of the bystanders, since he could have raised him not only by using his normal voice, but just by his will alone. In the same way, he could have done it from afar and with the stone in place. But instead, he came to the grave and spoke to those present, who took away the stone and smelt the stench. Then he cried with a loud voice. He raised him in his manner, so that by means of their sight, for they saw him standing at the grave, their sense of smell, for they were aware of the stench of the man 4 days dead, their senses of touch, for they used their own hands to take away the stone before the grave, and afterwards to loose the grave clothes from his body and napkin from his face, and their hearing, for the Lord's voice reached the ears of all. They all might understand and believe that it was he who called everything from non-being into being, who upheld all things by the word of his power, and who in the beginning of his word alone made everything that exists out of nothing. The simple people believed him in every aspect. He did not keep their faith quiet, but began to preach his divinity by deeds and works. Close quote. And finally, one could easily let the words of St. Gregory speak on their own. However, one could make two observations. The first one is about the deeply theological nature of the argument, which is based on the equality of honor and the identity of will of the Father and the Son. Quote, notice that the Father and the Son are of equal honor and have the same will, close quote. The second point is about the rather good example of how the same words could mean two different things to two different kinds of people. The simple ones who believed in the Lord in every aspect, and the ones who concerned themselves with words and the acquisition of wisdom by means of them. These second ones, according to St. Gregory, are less obedient by nature, which makes them missing the authentic reality of the events described in the Gospel. All right, that is part one. Let me know what you guys think. Please feel free to like and share if you think this is interesting, and I'll see you on part two. God bless.